C14 includes a request to raise the debt limit by an historic $663 billion, approximately 57% over the existing ceiling. And this includes $100 billion of undefined stimulus funding and another $223 billion of additional unallocated borrowing capacity. I'd like you to comment on the merits of asking for a massive increase in borrowing capacity in the absence of a budgetary framework and in the absence of any fiscal anchors to guide the government's management of its finances.
Thank you for the question. It's an issue that we have expressed concerns with in our December 10 report following the fall economic statement. In that December 10 report, we indicated that it's a bit unusual to have such an increase in the debt ceiling when there are items that are included for which there's no clear path forward. And for that, I refer to the $100 billion that was mentioned in the fall economic statement, well, $70 to $100 billion to be spent over 3 years, for which there's no clear indications as to what the items or the amounts will be spent on. So we've flagged that as an area worth considering for parliamentarians to ask questions to the government, because that's unusual. And it's unusual because there's no clear identified areas of spending for that amount. And the debt ceiling already includes some contingency amount of about $87 billion. So there is enough room to at least get that spending going if the government wishes to provide economic stimulus. So in summary, we find that a bit unusual, and that's why we raised it in our December 10th report.
Is it not more imprudent to first table a proper federal budget and then request the borrowing authorities required to support that budget?
That's the usual way to proceed with increases in the debt borrowing authority. It's usually included in a budget or accompanies a budget bill. So that's usually the way to do it. You present your longer term spending plan to parliamentarians and Canadians, and then you also seek, by the same token, an increase in the borrowing authority to accompany and to accommodate these spending plans. Some would say the fall economic statement was a mini budget, and with that respect, it contained many budgetary measures, but it's not a traditional budget in the sense that we expect it to be, because it's, as all of you know, it's been 2 years since we haven't seen a budget.
As you just mentioned, there is a contingency already built into the debt ceiling, and yet there's a massive amount of discretionary spending or borrowing available beyond that. So with respect to that additional discretionary spending and unallocated borrowing authority, do you believe that the amount is reasonable? I mean, we're talking about $100 billion of stimulus funding, and then beyond that, there's still some $223 billion of additional unallocated borrowing capacity. Is that reasonable? And if not, what would be a more appropriate ceiling to consider?
Well, reasonable is all in the eyes of the beholder, sir. So I would probably say it's amply sufficient. So it's largely sufficient to certainly, to say the least, to cover the needs expressed in the fall economic statement and some. So in my humble opinion, the $100 billion is probably premature to include in a Borrowing Authority Act, although it's up to you parliamentarians to decide on that, but it could have waited until such a time as the government lays out its plans for that additional spending. And if there are any unforeseen expenditures that need to take place, they could have been accommodated, or they could be still accommodated with that contingency amount of some $87 billion, which is, again, a very significant marge de manœuvre in the context of a borrowing authority.
Last question, Ed.
Mr. Giroux, you've raised concerns over the inability of parliamentarians to properly evaluate and scrutinize the government's borrowing and spending plans. Could you comment on what you consider to be the minimum amount of transparency one should expect of a federal government when it's asking for massive debt ceiling increases and billions of dollars of discretionary spending?
Well, traditionally, when the government tables a bill that seeks to increase its borrowing authority, it does that together with a budget, which clearly lays out its plans going forward, usually 5 years into the future. So we haven't seen that yet. We see a borrowing authority limit that's being sought before Parliament, but we don't have the same full picture that is usually accompanying such an increase through a budget. So the budget, hopefully the next budget will hopefully provide additional plans that will probably seek to better justify this increase in borrowing authority. But so far, it's only been a partial picture through the fall economic statement.
Thank you both. Turning to Mr. Fraser, followed by Mr. St. Marie. John?
Thanks very much. I appreciate you being with us here, Mr. Giroux, and I've just got a few questions, and I'll start where my colleague Mr. Fass left off on the issue of the borrowing authority sought in Bill C-14. I know some of my colleagues on this committee have previously referred to it as a blank check. I think Ms. Jansen actually used that phrase in the previous panel. I just want to get confirmation. There's a significant difference between the borrowing authority and spending decisions of Parliament. Could you just explain what that distinction, please?
Sure. So borrowing authority is the amount, the maximum amount that the Minister of Finance can borrow to finance government operations. It doesn't go together with spending authority. Spending authority itself is granted through separate bills. It can be legislative statutory authority, such as for employment insurance or old age security, which are permanent programs, for which Parliament does not need to vote on every year. And there's also operating expenditures, grants and subsidies, and so on, for which Parliament has to grant authority to spend on an annual basis. And that's done through main estimates and various supplementary estimates. So even though the borrowing authority can be increased, it does not grant authority for the government to spend. They have to seek spending through separate bills.
Don't forget to like, dislike, subscribe, and comment. Safe Space Cafe. And always, have a good day.